Hi, I'm Gregory Love, professor of Christian theology at San Francisco Theological Seminary. And today we begin a series on 4 different Christian views of God's relationship to the human suffering caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the 4 different views are as follows. Number 1, God's governance. Number 2, soul-making. Number 3, God as horrified. And number 4, the cross and resurrection of Jesus the Son. So those are the 4 different models we're going to be looking at in this series. Knowing these 4 different Christian answers will help you spot when a Christian talks about the pandemic. Knowing them will also help you identify your own view of God's relationship to the pandemic. Even Christians in the same church can have very different views and even opposing views of God's relationship to the pandemic. For example, one person says the pandemic is the will of God. God is causing it, bringing it about in order to bring about God's good purposes. Another person says the pandemic is not the will of God. Rather, God is against it and battling it. So 2 quite different views from people often sitting in the same pews in church. So that brings up the question, which we're going to look at today, how do we even come up with our views of God and suffering? Where do our views of God come from? And what we're going to discover is that there are different layers to our views of God. Almost like sediment in the soil. An early layer, a mid layer, and a recent layer. Okay? So I'm going to explain those different layers. Now, it's not surprising that the earliest layer comes from our childhood. Right? We actually get our views of God mostly formed, like most things in our life, by the age of 5. So child development experts who look at children and their views of God say that we get our views of God as children from 3 primary sources. The first source is that we get it from our primary caregivers. In other words, they not only have the biggest influence on us, but as children relating day by day to those caregivers, those people are authority figures. And so we naturally associate God, the ultimate authority, with however we've experienced those caregivers. The second source is whatever the official religion is in that culture. So the official religion, we would pick it up as we go to church, Sunday school, youth group. But even if we never go to church, we still pick it up from the culture. For example, from TV, from advertisements perhaps, certainly from politicians. So that's the second layer, the official religion. The third layer, the third place where we get our God image is from the wider world. So that would include our experience of the natural world, but also our extended family and people in town. So grandmothers, aunts and uncles, people we run into down the street. These also influence our view of God. So by the time we're 5, we already have the most basic understanding of who God is, what God is like, and how God relates to us and the world. Now, the second layer of where we get our view of God is there's 2 key influences. I call them the 2 rules of theology. The rules are this: all theology is autobiographical, and all theology is contextual. So what that means is, right, all theology is autobiographical. It means that our life experience from childhood to teenage years to young adulthood to adulthood, that life experience obviously shapes and reshapes our view of God. So, and everyone is influenced by that. All theology is contextual, In other words, we all live not just by ourselves, but in a social context, right? And so it matters whether you're African American, Latinx, Asian American, an indigenous person. It matters whether you're rich or poor in terms of your experience of the world and thus how you experience God. For example, African Americans, Latinx, those making less than $50,000 a year, they have had very different experiences of this pandemic and its consequences than other Americans. Okay, so that's our second layer. Then there's another layer on top of that one. And it's what we in the church in Christian theology call the four sources of our theology. Okay, this is standard. All the different Christian denominations and groups basically use these same four sources. And the four sources are these: Scripture, the Christian tradition, human reason, including philosophy, and human experience, including not only our personal experience, but the wider experiences picked up by the sciences. So, what do I mean by each of those? First, Scripture. People use the sacred texts of Christianity, which would be the Old and New Testaments, greatly shape our view of God and God's relationship to suffering. The Christian tradition also shapes it. So, for example, hymns, when you stand up and say the Apostles' Creed, what your pastor says, and what theologians in the past have said. People like Augustine or John Calvin. Third is you have human reason or logic. We're sensible human beings, and so we try and put all the pieces together of God and suffering and how it fits together. Sometimes we borrow from philosophers who are in the business of trying to think through logically how the world works and runs. Fourth, human experience. We not only listen to these great spiritual guides in Scripture and in tradition and in philosophy, but we also listen to ourselves. And so our experience of this world and of God, and what scientists pick up about the world. So those four sources shape our view of God. What you should know when we're looking in this series of the four different Christian answers is all these Christian groups are drawing from the same four sources. So then why do they come up with different views? Because they prioritize in different ways the four sources. Some start with Scripture and tradition primarily. Others start with reason and human experience. Creates a different view of God. All right, then there's another layer above this one. It's what I call the theological norm, which is a fancy term, but basically what it means is we all have something that's the center of our life, of our heart, and which we use to guide how we interpret our world and our experiences, right? A center. Now that center can be virtually anything and everything, right? For example, it could be a verse from Scripture. It could be a doctrine that we think is most important. But it could also be a fear that we feel deep down, or a desire that's burning in us. It could be anything, right? And that center guides our theology, even though we may be unconscious of what it is and that it's guiding our theology, right? It's very basic, very primal. So, for example, this is how it can shape somebody's view of God and suffering. Somebody's center might be there's somebody in control. Things are not just happening by chance. That's going to create one view of God. Somebody else's center could be God is sitting with me through this suffering. God understands me. That will also shape a view of God in suffering. Now, both of these may be true. They actually are. And both of them may fit together. But they may create very different understandings of how God is related to the world and to COVID. And what you should know is they're both comforting. At the end of the day, we're looking at these 4 different Christian views. These Christian views help people cope with fear and anxiety. That's why they exist. That's why we hold on to them very tightly and closely. But they help us cope with fear and anxiety in different ways. It's why they're going to have a different shape and feel, even though they're all given by Christians. That's what we're going to look at in this series.